I walked into the wrong room at the worst possible moment. My stepmom stood there, half-dressed, and my stomach dropped. But it wasn't the sight of her that made my skin crawl. It was the look she gave me. A slow, knowing smile, a secret in her eyes. And that's when I realized she had planned this. Stay with me till the end, because what happened next turned my world upside down. Growing up, it was always just me and my dad. We weren't rich, but we had enough, and more importantly, we had each other. He worked hard to keep a roof over our heads, and I did my best to be the son he could be proud of. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. Then, everything changed when Marissa entered our lives. I still remember the first time my dad introduced her to me. She was young, too young for him, I thought. Her smile was bright, her voice was soft, and she had this way of looking at people that made them feel like they were the only person in the world. My dad was smitten. I could see it in his eyes. The way he held on to her every word. The way he laughed just a little louder when she was around. But something about her made my stomach twist. She was too perfect, too polished, like someone who knew exactly how to play the part she was given. At first, I told myself I was just being protective. My dad had been alone for years, and maybe I just wasn't used to seeing him with someone new. So I kept my mouth shut. I tried to be polite, but the more time I spent around Marissa, the more uneasy I felt. It was the little things, like how she always seemed to be watching me when my dad wasn't looking, or how she'd touch my arm just a second too long when handing me something. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that maybe I was just being paranoid. But then came the comments. "You've grown up so well," she'd say, her voice slow, almost teasing. "Your dad must be so proud of you." Or, "You must have girls all over you. With a face like yours, I bet they don't leave you alone." It wasn't just the words. It was the way she said them, like she was testing me, waiting to see how I'd react. I laughed it off, ignored the way my skin crawled. My dad was happy, and that was all that mattered. Then, one night, something happened that I couldn't ignore. My dad was working late, and it was just me and Marissa in the house. I was in my room trying to focus on a movie when I heard soft footsteps in the hallway. I ignored them at first, probably just Marissa getting something from the kitchen. But then, my door creaked open. I turned my head, and there she was, standing in the dim light of the hallway, wearing nothing but a loose silk robe. I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs. And then, she smiled. A slow, knowing smile, like she had been waiting for this moment, like she had planned it all along. My breath caught in my throat. The air in the room felt heavier, suffocating. My mind screamed at me to look away, to say something, to do anything, but I couldn't move. Marissa stood there, leaning against the doorframe, the dim hallway light casting shadows over her face. Her robe was barely tied, the silk slipping off her shoulder. She didn't look embarrassed. She didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked amused. "You're up late," she murmured, tilting her head slightly. I swallowed hard. My pulse pounded in my ears. I was just watching a movie," I stammered, forcing my eyes anywhere but on her. She took a step into the room. "Couldn't sleep?" I gripped the edge of my blanket, my body tense. Something about this felt wrong, so wrong. "Yeah, something like that," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. She let out a soft chuckle, then ran a hand through her dark hair. "I get it. Some nights it's hard to relax." Another step closer. I could smell her perfume now, something sweet like vanilla and jasmine. My stomach churned. I should probably..." Before I could finish, she turned her back to me, letting the robe slip slightly, exposing more of her bare skin. "Oh," she sighed, as if just now realizing. "I didn't think you'd be awake." I shot up from the bed, panic gripping me. "I didn't mean to." She turned around slowly, her eyes locking onto mine. "It's okay," she whispered. "Accidents happen." The way she said it, like she wasn't talking about this moment, but something else, sent a chill through me. My legs felt weak. My mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. I needed to get out of there fast. I should go to bed," I blurted, brushing past her as quickly as possible. My hands were clammy, my body rigid as I moved toward the door. But just as I reached for the handle, her voice stopped me cold. "You don't have to tell your dad." I froze. The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. My fingers trembled against the doorknob. Slowly I turned my head. She was watching me with a small, knowing smile, like she had just placed a bet and was waiting to see if she had won. I forced a laugh, trying to act like I didn't understand what she meant. "Yeah, no problem, nothing to tell." Her smile widened. "Good," she murmured. I yanked the door open and walked out as fast as I could without running. My heart pounded with every step back to my room. I shut my door, locked it, and pressed my back against it, breathing hard. This wasn't in my head. This wasn't paranoia. Marissa was playing a dangerous game, and I had just become a part of it. I barely slept that night. My mind replayed the scene over and over, the way she stood in my doorway, the way she smiled like she knew something I didn't, the way she said, "You don't have to tell your dad." It wasn't just a comment, it was a warning, a test, and I had no idea what would happen next. The next morning I tried to act normal. I went downstairs for breakfast, forcing myself to ignore the lump in my throat. My dad was already at the table, sipping his coffee, scrolling through emails on his phone. Marissa was in the kitchen, humming softly as she cooked. I hesitated in the doorway, every instinct telling me to turn around and leave. But that would be obvious, and the last thing I wanted was for my dad to notice something was off. So I sat down. Marissa turned, her eyes meeting mine instantly. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, too smoothly, too familiar. I forced a nod, picking at my food. I could feel her watching me, studying me, waiting to see if I would break. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, her voice dripping with something I couldn't quite place. I swallowed hard. "Yeah, fine." She smiled. But there was something behind it. Something knowing, something teasing. I pushed my food around my plate, barely touching it. My dad, oblivious as always, glanced up. "You feeling okay?" I nodded quickly. "Yeah, just not hungry." Marissa tilted her head, eyes still locked on me. "Maybe he just had a long night," she said casually, stirring her coffee. My stomach clenched. My dad didn't notice. He just chuckled. "You should get more sleep, kid." I forced a laugh, but inside I felt like I was suffocating. From that morning on, everything changed. Marissa got bolder. She'd brush past me in the kitchen, her hand grazing my arm for just a second too long. She'd call me into the living room late at night to help her with something, adjust the TV, grab a book from a high shelf, always small, simple tasks. But every time she made sure my dad wasn't around, and every time she looked at me like she was daring me to say something. I avoided her as much as I could. Spent more time out of the house, buried myself in anything that kept me away. But no matter how hard I tried, she always found a way to pull me back in. Then one night, she took things even further. I had just come back from a late shift at work. The house was quiet. My dad had already gone to bed. I headed upstairs, exhausted, ready to collapse into my bed. But when I reached my room, I stopped. Because there, sitting on my bed, was Marissa, wearing my shirt, her legs crossed, her eyes locked onto mine, and that same slow smile on her lips. This wasn't a game anymore. It was a trap. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. Marissa sat on my bed, one leg crossed over the other, the dim light of my lamp casting shadows on her face. But it wasn't just the way she sat there, it was what she was wearing, my shirt. It hung loosely over her frame, barely covering her thighs. Her fingers traced the hem absent-mindedly as she tilted her head, watching me. "You're home late," she said softly, like this was normal, like this was just another conversation between two people who weren't supposed to be in this situation. I swallowed hard, gripping the doorknob so tight my knuckles turned white. What are you doing in here?" she sighed, stretching her arms above her head as if she had just woken up. "Your dad went to bed early, I couldn't sleep." Her voice was smooth, too casual. She patted the spot next to her. "I figured I'd wait up for you." My entire body screamed at me to run, to get out of that room and never look back. But she was blocking the way, not physically, but with something worse, control. I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. "Marissa, this isn't okay." She let out a soft chuckle, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Oh, relax. You act like I'm doing something terrible." Her eyes darkened slightly. "It's just us, you know." I took a step back. "You should go." Her smile faltered, just for a second, then, just as quickly, it returned. But this time there was something behind it, something sharp. She uncrossed her legs and stood up slowly, closing the small space between us. "You don't have to be so nervous," she whispered. "I thought we had an understanding." I backed up against the door. "There is no understanding." She sighed, her expression shifting into something almost disappointed. Then her voice dropped to a whisper. "If you don't want me here," she murmured, "then I guess I should call your dad." My breath hitched. "What?" She smiled again, but this time it wasn't playful. It was calculated, cold. "I could wake him up right now, tell him you came into my room last night, tell him you've been acting inappropriate." My stomach dropped. "You're lying," she shrugged. "Am I?" I felt sick, trapped. She had backed me into a corner and she knew it. If she told my dad anything, he would believe her. He loved her, he trusted her. And all she had to do was twist the truth just enough to make me look guilty. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breathing. "Why are you doing this?" She laughed softly, reaching out to adjust the collar of my shirt. "Because I like watching you squirm." I jerked away from her touch. I had to get out of this. I had to find a way to end this before she destroyed everything. But first, I needed proof. I needed to catch her in the act. I barely slept that night. My mind raced with one thought. If I didn't stop Marissa, she would ruin everything. My relationship with my dad, my future, my entire life. I had to be smart, I had to be careful, and most importantly, I needed proof. The next morning I woke up early and set my plan in motion. I placed my phone on a bookshelf in the living room, camera facing outward, barely noticeable among the decorations. I set it to record and left, making sure Marissa knew I was home alone with her. Now I just had to wait, and like clockwork, she took the bait. Late in the afternoon, she called me into the living room. I found her sitting on the couch, her legs tucked under her, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked up at me with that familiar smirk, the one that made my skin crawl. "Come sit with me," she said, patting the empty space beside her. I forced a nervous chuckle. "I'm good standing." She tilted her head, watching me carefully. "You've been avoiding me." I didn't answer. She sighed and leaned forward, resting her elbow on her knee. "You don't have to be scared, you know. Your dad would never believe anything bad about you." Then she gave me a wicked smile. But he'd believe me. There it was, the trap. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. She shrugged, swirling the wine in her glass. "Because I can." My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You won't get away with it," I said carefully. She raised an eyebrow. "And who's going to stop me?" I pulled out my phone and turned the screen toward her. Her smirk disappeared. I hit play, and her own voice filled the room. "Your dad would never believe anything bad about you, but he'd believe me." Marissa's face drained of colour. "Oops," I said. "Guess I recorded that by accident." She shot up from the couch. "Delete that, now." I shook my head. "Not a chance." Her breathing grew heavy, her hands clenched into fists. "If you show him that—" "Oh, I will," I cut in. "And guess what? He's not going to believe you this time." Just then, the front door opened. My dad stepped in, looking between us with confusion. "What's going on?" Marissa's eyes widened. She spun around, plastering on her sweetest expression. "Honey, I didn't let her finish. I hit play again, letting my dad hear every single word. His face twisted in shock. He looked at Marissa like he was seeing her for the first time. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous. Marissa stammered, but there was nothing she could say. The proof was right there. "Get out," my dad said coldly. Tears filled her eyes, but they weren't real. She knew she had lost. She grabbed her purse and stormed toward the door. Before leaving, she turned to glare at me one last time. "This isn't over," she whispered. But it was. I turned to my dad, expecting anger, disappointment, something, but instead he just looked broken. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have listened to you." I let out a shaky breath. It was finally over. But deep down I knew Marissa wouldn't forget this, and one day she might come back. But if she did, I'd be ready. Trust your instincts. Sometimes they're the only thing keeping you safe.